This is to resume my reading of The Storyteller by Walter Benjamin. It's his essay on the works of Nikolai Leskov. Uh, I had to cut short the earlier recording because of some trouble with the hardware here. But anyway, we are back on track. I think I had paused earlier when the example of Don Quixote was taken up just after recounting a quote from Lukács's theory of the novel regarding how a moment becomes recognizable for a reader within the purview of a certain form and so on. The meaning of life is really the center about which the novel moves. But the quest for it is no more than the initial expression of perplexity with which its reader sees himself living this written life. Here, meaning of life, there, moral of the story. With these slogans, novel and story confront each other, and from them, the totally different historical coordinates of these art forms may be discerned. If Don Quixote is the earliest perfect specimen of the novel, its latest exemplar is perhaps the Education Sentimentale. In the final words of the last named novel, the meaning which the bourgeois age found in its behavior at the beginning of its decline has settled like sediment in the cup of life. Frederick and Descholiers, the boyhood friends, think back to their youthful friendship. This little incident then occurred. One day they showed up in the bordello of their hometown, stealthily and timidly, doing nothing but presenting the patron with a bouquet of flowers which they had picked in their own gardens. This story was still discussed 3 years later, and now they told it to each other in detail, each supplementing the recollection of the other. That may have been, said Frederick, when they had finished, the finest thing in our lives. Yes, you may be right, said Descholiers. That was perhaps the finest thing in our lives. With such an insight, the novel reaches an end which is more proper to it in its stricter sense than to any story. Actually, there is no story for which the question as to how it continued would not be legitimate. The novelist, on the other hand, cannot hope to take the smallest step beyond that limit at which he invites the reader to a divinatory realization of the meaning of life by writing Fini. A man listening to a story is in the company of the storyteller. Even a man reading one shares this companionship. A man listening to a story is in the company of the storyteller. Even a man reading one shares this companionship. The reader of a novel, however, is isolated, more so than any other reader. For even the reader of a poem is ready to utter the words for the benefit of the listener. In this solitude of his, the reader of a novel seizes upon his material more jealously than anyone else. He is ready to make it completely his own, to devour it, as it were. Indeed, he destroys, he swallows up the material as the fire devours logs in the fireplace. The suspense which permeates the novel is very much like the draught which stimulates the flame in the fireplace and enlivens its play. It is a dry material on which the burning interest of the reader feeds. A man who dies at the age of 35, said Moritz Heimann once, is at every point of his life a man who dies at the age of 35. Nothing is more dubious than this sentence, but for the sole reason that the tense is wrong. A man so says the truth that was meant here, who died at 35, will appear to remembrance at every point in his life as a man who dies at the age of 35. In other words, the statement that makes no sense for real life becomes indisputable for remembered life. The nature of the character in a novel cannot be presented any better than is done in this statement, which says that the meaning of his life is revealed only in his death. But the reader of a novel actually does look for human beings from whom he derives the meaning of life. Therefore, he must, no matter what, know in advance that he will share their experience of death. If need be, their figurative death, the end of the novel, but preferably their actual one. How do the characters make him understand that death is already waiting for them, a very definite death, and at a very definite place? That is the question which feeds the reader's consuming interest in the events of the novel. A rather grim sentence, let me get this right. How do the characters make him understand that death is already waiting for them? A very definite death, and at a very definite place. That is the question which feeds the reader's consuming interest in the events of the novel. The novel is significant, therefore, not because it presents someone else's fate to us, perhaps didactically, but because this stranger's fate, by virtue of the flame which consumes it, yields us the warmth which we never draw from our own fate. What draws the reader to the novel is the hope of warming his shivering life with a death he reads about. Leskov, writes Gorky, is the writer most deeply rooted in the people and is completely untouched by any foreign influences. A great storyteller will always be rooted in the people, primarily in the milieu of craftsmen. But just as this includes the rural, the maritime, and the urban elements in the many stages of their economic and technical development, there are many gradations in the concepts in which their store of experience comes down to us. To say nothing of the by no means insignificant share which traders had in the art of storytelling. Their task was less to increase the didactic content than to refine the tricks with which the attention of the listener was captured. They have left deep traces in the narrative cycle of the Arabian Nights. In short, despite the primary role which storytelling plays in the household of humanity, the concepts through which the yield of the stories may be garnered are manifold. What may be most readily be put in religious terms in Leskov seems almost automatically to fall into place in the pedagogical perspective of the Enlightenment in Hebel, appears as hermetic tradition in Poe, finds at last a refuge in Kipling in the life of the British seamen and colonial soldiers. All great storytellers have in common the freedom with which they move up and down the rungs of their experience as on a ladder. A ladder extending downwards to the interior of the earth and disappearing into the clouds is the image for a collective experience to which even the deepest shock of every individual experience, death, constitutes no impediment or barrier. And they lived happily ever after, says the fairy tale. The fairy tale, which to this day is the first tutor of children, because it was once the first tutor of mankind, secretly lives on in the story. The first true storyteller is and will continue to be the teller of fairy tales. Whenever good counsel was at a premium, the fairy tale had it, and where the need was greater, its aid was nearest. This need was the need created by the myth. The fairy tale tells us of the earliest arrangements that mankind made to shake off the nightmare which the myth had placed upon its chest. In the figure of the fool, it shows us how mankind acts dumb towards the myth. In the figure of the youngest brother, it shows us how one's chances increases as the mythical primitive times are left behind. In the figure of the man who sets out to learn what fear is, it shows us that the things we are afraid of can be seen through in the figures of the wiseacre. It shows us that the questions posed by the myth are simple-minded, like the riddles of the Sphinx. I don't quite know what wiseacre means. Just check that out. Something like a know-all. Where was I? 1 second. Yeah, in the figure of the wiseacre, it shows us that the questions posed by the myth are simple-minded, like the riddle of the Sphinx. In the shape of the animals which come to the aid of the child in the fairy tale, it shows that nature not only is subservient to the myth, but much prefers to be aligned with man. The wisest thing, so the fairy tale taught mankind, is in olden times, and teaches children to this day, is to meet the forces of the mythical world with cunning and with high spirits. This is how the fairy tale polarizes Mut, courage, dividing it dialectically into Untermut, that is cunning, and Ubermut, high spirits. The liberating magic which the fairy tale has at its disposal does not bring nature into play in a mythical way, but points to its complicity with liberated man. Hmm. Well, it's been a while since I've read a fairy tale, but would be interesting to see how this plays out in one of them. A mature man feels this complicity only occasionally, that is, when he is happy. But the child first meets it in fairy tales, and it makes him happy. Few storytellers have displayed so profound a kinship with the spirit of the fairy tale as did Leskov. This involves tendencies that were promoted by the dogmas of the Greek Orthodox Church, as is well known, Origen's speculations about apokatasis, the entry of all souls into paradise, which was rejected by the Roman Church, plays a significant part in these dogmas. Leskov was very much influenced by Origen and played to translate his work on first principles. In keeping with Russian folk belief, he interpreted the resurrection less as a transfiguration than as a disenchantment, in a sense akin to the fairy tale. Such an interpretation of Origen is at the bottom of the enchanted pilgrim. In this, as in many other tales by Leskov, a hybrid between fairy tale and legend is involved, but not unlike that hybrid which Ernst Bloch mentions in a connection in which he utilizes our distinction between myth and fairy tale in his fashion. I'm not particularly familiar with it. A hybrid between fairy tale and myth, he says, contains figuratively mythical elements. Mythical elements whose effect is certainly captivating and static, and yet not outside man. In the legend, there are Taoist figures, especially very old ones, which are mythical in this sense. For instance, the couple Philemon and Baucis magically escaped through, though in natural repose, and surely there is a similar relationship between fairy tale and legend in the Taoist climate of Gotthelf, which, to be sure, is on a much lower level. At certain points, it divorces the legend from the locality of the spell, rescues the flame of life, the specifically human flame of life, calmly burning within as without. Magically escaped are the beings that lead the procession of Leskov's creation. The righteous ones, Pavlin, Figura, the Tupi artist, the bear keeper, the helpful sentry, all of them embodiments of wisdom, kindness, comfort, the world, crowd, about the storyteller. They are unmistakably suffused with the imago of his mother. This is how Leskov describes her. She was so thoroughly good that she was not capable of harming any man, not even an animal. She ate neither meat nor fish because she had such pity for living creatures. Sometimes my father used to reproach her with this, but she answered, "I have raised the little animals myself. They are like my children to me." "I can't eat my own children, can I?" She would not eat meat at a neighbor's house either. I have been, I have seen them alive, she would say. They are my acquaintances. I can't eat my acquaintances, can I? The righteous man is the advocate for created things, and at the same time, he is their highest embodiment. In Leskov, he has a maternal touch which is occasionally intensified into the mythical, and thus, to be sure, engenders the purity of the fairy tale. Typically of this is the protagonist of his story, Kotin, the provider, and Plotonida. This figure, a peasant named Pisonsky, is a hermaphrodite. For 12 years, his mother raised him as a girl. His male and female organs mature simultaneously, and his bisexuality becomes the symbol of God incarnate. In Leskov's view, the pinnacle of creation has been attained with this, and at the same time, he presumably sees it as a bridge established between this world and the other. For these earthly, powerful, maternal male figures, which again and again claim Leskov's skill as a storyteller, have been removed from obedience to the sexual drive in the bloom of their strength. They do not, however, really embody an ascetic ideal. Rather, the continence of these righteous men has so little private character that it becomes the elemental counterpoise to uncontrollable lust, which the storyteller has personified in Lady Macbeth of Mazenx. If the range between a pavlin and his merchant's wife covers the breadth of the world of created beings, in the hierarchy of his characters, Leskov has no less plumbed its depth. The hierarchy of the world of created things, which has its apex in the righteous man, reaches down into the abyss of the inanimate by many gradations. In this connection, one particular has to be noted. This whole created world speaks not so much with the human voice as with what could be called the voice of nature. In the title of one of Leskov's most significant stories, the story deals with the petty official Philip Filipovich, who leaves no stone unturned to get the chance to have as his house guest a field marshal passing through his little town. He manages to do so. The guest, who is at first supervised at the clerk's urgent invitation, gradually comes to believe that he recognizes in him someone he must have met previously. But who is he? He cannot remember. The strange thing is that the host, for his part, is not willing to reveal his identity. Instead, he puts off the high personage from day to day, saying that the voice of nature will not fail to speak distinctly to him one day. This goes on until the guest, shortly before continuing on his journey, must grant the host's public request to let the voice of nature resound. Thereupon, the host's wife withdraws. She returned with a big, brightly polished copper hunting horn, which she gave to her husband. He took the horn, put it to his lips, and was at the same instant as though transformed. Hardly had he inflated his cheeks and produced a tone as powerful as the rolling of thunder when the field marshal cried, "Stop! I've got it now. Brother, this makes me recognize you at once. You are the burglar from the regiment of Jaegers, and because you were so honest, I sent you to keep an eye on a crooked supplies supervisor." "That's it, Your Excellency," answered the host. "I didn't want to remind you of this myself, but wanted to let the voice of nature speak." The way the profundity of this story is hidden beneath its silliness conveys the idea of Leskov's magnificent humor. This humor is confirmed in the same story in an even more cryptic way. We have heard that because of his honesty, the official was assigned to watch a crooked supplies supervisor. This is what we are told at the end, in the recognition scene. At the very beginning of the story, however, we learn the following about the host. All the inhabitants of the town were acquainted with the man. They knew that he did not hold a high office, for he was neither a state official nor a military man, but a little supervisor at the tiny supply depot, where together with the rats he chewed on the state rusks and boot soles, and in the course of time had chewed himself together a nice little frame house. It is evident that this story reflects the traditional sympathy which storytellers have for rascals and crooks. All the literature of farce bears witness to it. Nor is it denied on the heights of art of all Hebel's characters, the Brassenheim Miller, Tinderfrieder, and Red Dieter, have been his most faithful companions. And yet, for Hebel, too, the righteous man has the main role in the Theatrum Mundi. But because no one is actually up to this role, it keeps changing hands. Now it is the tramp, now the haggling Jew, peddler, now the man of limited intelligence who steps in to play this part. In every single case, it is a guest performance, a moral improvisation. Hebel is a casuist. Casuist. Who is a casuist? A casuist is someone who uses clever but unsound reasoning. He will not for anything take a stand with any principle, but he does not reject it either. For any principle can at some time become the instrument of the righteous man. Compare this with Leskov's attitude. "I realize," he writes in his story, apropos of the Kreutzer Sonata, "that my thinking is based much more on a practical view of life than on abstract philosophy or lofty morality. But I am nevertheless used to thinking the way I do." To be sure, the most catastrophes that appear in Leskov's world are to be the moral incidents in Hebel's world, as the great, silent flowing of the Volga is to the babbling, rushing little mill stream. Among Leskov's historical tales, there are several in which passions are at work as destructively as the wrath of Achilles or the hatred of Hagen. It is astonishing how fearfully the world can darken for this author, and with what majesty evil can raise its scepter. Leskov has evidently known moods, and this is probably one of the few characteristics he shares with Dostoevsky, in which he was close to antinomian ethics and antinomian ethics, in which he was close to antinomian ethics. The elemental nature in his tales from Aldgen times go to the limit in their ruthless passion. But it is precisely the mystics, who have been inclined to see this limit as the point at which utter depravity turns into saintliness. The lower Leskov descends on the scale of created things, the more obviously does his way of viewing things approach the mystical. Actually, as will be shown, there is much evidence that in this too, a characteristic is revealed which is inherent in the nature of the storyteller. To be sure, only a few have ventured into the depths of inanimate nature, and in modern narrative literature, there is not much in which the voice of the anonymous storyteller, who was prior to all literature, resounds so clearly as it does in Leskov's story, The Alexandrite. It deals with a semi-precious stone, the chrysoberyl. The mineral is the lowest stratum of created things. For the storyteller, however, it is directly joined to the highest. To him it is granted to see in this chrysoberyl a natural prophecy of petrified, lifeless nature concerning the historical world in which he himself lives. This world is the world of Alexander II. The storyteller, or rather the man to whom he attributes his own knowledge, is a gem engraver named Wenzel, who has achieved the greatest conceivable skill in his art. One can just juxtapose him with the silversmiths of Tula and say that in the spirit of Leskov, the perfect artisan has access to the innermost chamber of the realm of created things. He is an incarnation of the devout. We are told of this gem cutter. He suddenly squeezed my hand, on which was the ring with the Alexandrite, which is known to sparkle red in artificial light, and cried, "Look, here it is, the prophetic Russian stone. O crafty Siberian, it was always green as hope, and only towards evening was it suffused with blood. It was that way from the beginning of the world, but it concealed itself for a long time, lay hidden in the earth, and permitted itself to be found only on the day when Tsar Alexander was declared of age. When a great sorcerer had come to Siberia to find the stone, a magician—" "What nonsense are you talking?" I interrupted him. "This stone wasn't found by a magician at all. It was a scholar named Nordenskjold." "A magician, I tell you, a magician," screamed Wenzel in a loud voice. "Just look, what a stone! A green morning is in it, and a blood evening. This is fate, the fate of noble Tsar Alexander. With these words, old Wenzel turned to the wall, propped his head on his elbows, and began to sob. One can hardly come any closer to the meaning of this significant story than by the words which Paul Valery wrote in a very remote context. Artistic observation, he says, in Reflections on a woman artist, whose work consists in the silk embroidery of figures, can attain an almost mystical depth. The objects on which it falls lose their names. Light and shade form very particular systems, present very individual questions, which depend upon no knowledge and are derived from no practice, but get their existence and value exclusively from a certain accord of the soul, the eye, and the hand of someone who was born to perceive them and evoke them in his own inner self. With these words, soul, eye, and hand are brought into connection, interacting with one another. They determine a practice. We are no longer familiar with this practice. The role of the hand in production has become more modest, and the place it filled in storytelling lies waste. After all, storytelling in its sensory aspect is by no means a job for the voice alone. Rather, in genuine storytelling, the hand plays a part which supports what is expressed in 100 ways with its gestures trained by work. That old coordination of the soul, the eye, and the hand, which emerges in Valéry's words, is that of the artisan which we encounter wherever the art of storytelling is at home. In fact, one can go on and ask oneself whether the relationship of the storyteller to his material, human life is not in itself a craftsman's relationship. Whether it is not his very task to fashion the raw material of experience, his own and that of others, in a solid, useful, and unique way. It is a kind of procedure which may perhaps most adequately be exemplified by the proverb, if one thinks of it as an ideogram of a story. An ideogram, would that be similar to a concept or an idea or a particular style? Who knows? An ideogram is a character symbolizing the idea of a thing without indicating the sounds used to say it. Examples include numerals and Chinese characters. It's a kind of procedure which may perhaps most adequately be exemplified by the proverb, if one thinks of it as an ideogram of a story. A proverb, one might say, is a ruin which stands on the site of an old story in which a moral twines around a happening, like ivy around a wall. Seen in this way, the storyteller joins the ranks of the teachers and sages. He has counsel, not for a few situations, as the proverb does, but for many, like the sage. For it is granted to him to reach back to a whole lifetime, a life incidentally that comprises not only his own experience, but no little of the experience of others. What the storyteller knows about hearsay is added to his own. His gift is the ability to relate his life. His distinction is to be able to tell his entire life. The storyteller, he is the man who could let the wick of his life be consumed completely by the gentle flame of his story. This is the basis of the incomparable aura about the storyteller in Leskov as in Hoff, in Poe as in Stevenson. The storyteller is the figure in which the righteous man encounters himself. I must tell you that I first came across this essay by Walter Benjamin when I was reading the Illuminations in my master's in sociology. There was a friend named Nikhil, and we sat down and read it together. And it was an amazing experience. There's something about the act of reading in an essay, an interpretative essay, with a friend who is willing to offer their insights on how they understand a passage, for them to present that as a point of view for another, to have that trust with someone else, and to welcome what they have to say as a point of view which can illuminate what one's own position may have been. I think that's where an interpretative process actually becomes something more than a mere evaluation of the veracity of a claim, but tries to construct something out of perspectives which seek to understand another. Apart from how I encountered the essay, there is something about the circumstances within which Walter Benjamin was writing these. And please bear in mind that this is a situation where Europe was recovering warily from the First World War, which he mentions in the essay. The second was probably already looming. I have unfortunately not dated precisely when this essay was written, but it is worth looking up, and I probably should have done so. In my impatience, I may have sought to make a video before I did that. Yet, I think there is a sense in which he must have picked when to actually write this carefully. He also chooses the writer that he wants to draw his analogies, his set of criticisms, his interpretations, his insights from, with a sense of someone who waited for a particular point in his life to bring forth a point of view which he believed ought to stand for posterity. And I'd like to say that this is in many ways emblematic of the kind of work that Walter Benjamin has done. It is one of the reasons he is as enduring a figure in contemporary criticism, is still brought up in debates regarding the Frankfurt School, and is still prescribed and taught in curriculars in universities. And I think it's a true tragedy where a sociology department, a history faculty, or a literature department choose to ignore such a precedent. If there is something that I would have liked to have been able to pursue in this essay which was not already developed, may be what kind of stories would Seaman actually be able to convey to a tiller of the soil. I mean, I can only imagine the place in which these two voices meet. Would it be a marketplace? Would it be a small university town? These are unknown, undeveloped threads. Also, in a sense of style, like there's this rather reductive phrase, if I may use an insult, that is circulated in academia these days. It's almost a prescription. It's called self-reflection. They say that an interpretation ought to be self-reflective, to be able to take into account its own point of view in the interpretation that it's making. I think that any such gesture can only be made in consideration of another. The question then that rises is, which other is this? Is this the other of the finite reader? Is this an invocatory other, like a prophet calling for the people? Is it a politicized other, like the proletariat, etc., and so forth? And this would determine how the voice or the author seeks to determine the course of a narrative in its addresser. I think Benjamin is sensitive to who he may be speaking of and from where he may be speaking in a way that might have been missed by many later advocates of such a self-reflective position. And I believe if you were to read the essay with some care, this may dawn on you. That aside, I hope I have not been a bore, because it isn't the most racy stuff. Yet I believe it is still worth consideration, and I can't say I hope, but I wish that when you were to come across new stories and circumstances in your life, you may perhaps bring forth a set of coordinates via which to see them and from which to probe them, to inquire after them, which perhaps may not have been as easily evident or approachable earlier. And without any further ceremony, I shall call it an evening. Thank you for your time. Bye bye.